So up next, I mean, the question was brought up about soil health, and that was not a planted question, but our next session is going to address soil health and other aspects. This is a really neat collaboration that we've put together with Earth Knowledge, a big data analytics company, and with Dr. Gerry Hatfield, who's with the National Lab on Ag and the Environment in Ames, Iowa, of all places. And Gerry's well known for working on soil health and trying to look at what impact that has on crops, and not just look at single instance problems, you know, 1 year with one crop, but really look at what's the whole cropping pattern been, what's the soil health, what's the soil type, what's the climate been, and what are all these impacts that that are the disease triggers and cause these diseases. So we're excited about this collaboration, and our next presenter is in person going to be Dr. Frank Daniese from Earth Knowledge, and Julia Daniese is here also, president of Earth Knowledge. And then on the phone, you're going to hear him on audio is Dr. Gerry Hatfield from Iowa, and Frank will introduce him. But I'm going to turn it over to Frank.
So as Paul was saying, we're thrilled to have Gerry as a member of this this collaborative. Earth Knowledge and USDA ARS, the National Lab for Agriculture and the Environment, which Gerry is the director. We have a collaborative research agreement with USDA to work on development of decision-based tools using data analytics and spatial analytics for the specialty crop industry. And early on in that effort, we also had been having discussions with Paul and the board here, and we decided to have fresh produce be one of our focus areas in our collaboration. Gerry has been at this for quite some time. As Paul mentioned, despite the fact that he's located in Ames, he is pretty much global in his work and his research. Actually taught for a while at UC Davis, had done some work here in Arizona at the Arid Lands Lab, and has been with USDA for over 30 years. So plus. So we'll get going. So what we're going to talk about is soil health and soil-borne disease, and what we're going to be talking about is a very integrative study, which so far has two parts. The first part we'll talk about, and then we'll start talking about some of the future steps that we're going through. But on this slide here for project steps, really we were engaged in conversations with Paul and some of the growers because they had been experiencing these yield and quality impacts as a result of soil-borne disease. Earth Knowledge and USDA had this initiative going on specialty crops, and we decided to conduct a road mapping exercise, in which case we would be able to identify both technologies and data and knowledge that's available either in the USDA, in the academic institutions, in the industry, that might be easily taken and operationalized and integrated into an online cloud-based tool that can help with decision making. We'll go through these other steps as well, identifying YCEDA members, collecting some of their historical data, and we'll step through that as we go through. The road mapping exercise was basically a collaborative effort between YCEDA, Earth Knowledge, and USDA. YCEDA contributed $50,000 in cash, Earth Knowledge and USDA approximately $50,000 each in kind, to take a look at these key sort of components. Look at things like soil-borne disease, the pathology, soil factors, cultural practices, what we might be able to do about aggregating and analyzing historical grower data, taking a closer look at sensor technology, whether it's space-based, air-based, on-ground, or in-ground, looking at cropping systems, which is a very holistic systems approach look at the agricultural process, looking at different forms of analytics, models, decision tools, and then issues about scaling, because obviously we're taking samples at a particular point in the field, or we're looking at a particular field in a ranch. And what we want to do is extrapolate that to make some better understanding about what's going on in these different growing regions. And looking at this technology, we use a technology readiness ranking system. Technologies rated 5 are pretty ready to be adapted, pretty easily operationalized into a tool like we're talking. Technologies with a lower readiness, really not quite ready for prime time to adapt into an operationalized tool. So things like soil health factors contributing to soil-borne disease. You've heard a lot of this morning from Mike and Barry. These are the types of things that we are learning from them. And so we took a close look at these. And there's quite a bit going on both here in Yuma at U of A and also at UC Davis, looking at things like pathogens, how they survive in the plant debris, diagnosis and monitoring, control options, those types of things. And also some work being done on how climate variability might be affecting these in California. Historical grower data. What can be done to aggregate, integrate, and look at the data that all of you are gathering on a regular basis and really understand the relationships that data is telling us about your field practices, your cultural practices, and not just when you're growing lettuce, but when you're growing everything else in that field across the entire year, across the entire growing season. And then also use that information to better, more efficiently design sensor systems to put out in the field. So we're not just gathering data for the sake of gathering lots of data, but we're gathering data that's going to reduce uncertainty in specific models that we might be creating. We took a close look at imaging, remote sensing applications, everything from satellite-based systems that might have a 30-meter effective resolution all the way down to drones that are about, about a centimeter in resolution. Obviously, all of these have pros and cons. What we're looking for really is something that will be able to give us the spatial resolution, be able to distinguish between a head of lettuce, and also something that is going to give us a flyby more often than, say, once a month or once or twice a month, something like that, something daily, preferably. And there's obviously lots of different opportunities, different choices here. But as you start getting into more of the drone-based technologies, you basically need to have somebody out there on the field every day flying those things. And so what we're trying to do is find the right balance between labor and volume of data and frequency of data and resolution of data. So here's a good example, right? The Landsat thematic mapper data, it's free, which makes it very good, but it's a very low spatial resolution. And you also get a pass by on the field once or twice every month. Not very good at distinguishing between our particular crop of choice, lettuce, romaine, those types of things. When you start getting into more higher resolution, like the 1 meter iconos data, you're starting to distinguish things in the field much better, but this starts to raise the volume of data that you're having to manage on a regular basis. Also, issues of time resolution. This is an NDVI. Basically, this is one image on one day, sometime in the growing season. It's a snapshot and basically tells you something about leaf area index. Well, when we're growing lettuce, you got a lot of soil in that image when you're looking down from space. And so these types of tools, while useful for more continuous canopies, less useful for things that are discontinuous. And so we start getting into issues of higher spatial resolution. This is a manned aircraft-based platform which is providing 1.5-inch resolution. Obviously can tell the difference between young kale and more mature kale. But you need to have somebody up in the plane flying that thing on a regular basis, and the volume of this data gets to be fairly large, which is where we start to use cloud-based capabilities. And obviously you could start to get a better sense of where things are healthy, where things are not healthy, and you could start to get a better idea of things like yield estimation using these tools. We're also looking at in-ground monitoring, on-ground monitoring, and in-ground monitoring. This is where the synergy of a lot of the different projects here at YCEDA are going to coalesce. You'll be hearing about some other studies on salinity in soils and water and that sort of thing. And then also some of the field trials that you've been hearing about from Barry and Mike are also, those fields are incorporated into some of the data that we're gathering right now. So we'll talk about that a little bit. Cropping systems, this is where Gerry and his folks, in addition to being a meteorologist, plant meteorologist, and a remote sensing expert, he's also an expert in cropping systems, and all of these different areas of soil health, modeling, plant stress, climate variability. Actually, Gerry is one of the members of the International Panel on Climate Change that received the Nobel, shared the Nobel back in about 9 or 10 years ago. So obviously has a lot of experience in these areas. So a lot of advancement in these areas, a lot of these tools are now available to be adopted and applied for an operational tool for detecting and then avoiding or mitigating soil-borne disease. So ultimately what we're looking for is a whole systems model where we are able to discretize this at different variable spatial resolutions, different temporal resolutions, and be able to look at the whole soil, water, plant, atmosphere system for a given field over the course of the entire year. Not just when we're growing one crop, over 90 or 120 days, all 365 days of the year, because this stuff, as we've heard from Barry and Mike, it's living in the soil all the time. And so we want to see if there are indications of the presence of fusarium and other types of soil-borne disease, and how that might be impacting or manifesting itself at other times of the year. Also, we want to understand how well we can predict a week ahead of time, a year ahead of time, that kind of thing. And that's where the importance of this historical data comes into effect. The technology is there that we can calibrate our biophysical models, our process models, our analytical models, our landscape-based models quite well. There's quite a bit of statistics available to us and uncertainty analysis available to us that we can understand how well these models are projecting into the future. But in order to do that, we need to have a pretty good historical record. So just flying over, getting some data from a satellite or a drone, that's one piece of it, but really what we need to know is what's been going on over the full course of the year and what has been going on historically. And Gerry will give some insight into that. As a rule of thumb, 10 years of data can provide a predictive 1 year into the future, okay? So that's why we're working, and we'll tell you a little bit about this, we're working with our growers to collect this data, to homogenize it, and then to start using it to make projections into the future. And then as we start to improve that, we'll improve our data gathering capabilities moving forward. But the tools and technologies to do this predictive capability are there. And then scaling. Scaling from the plant to the farm, from one farm to another farm, and from one farm to the entire region. And you'll see geographically on the map what we're looking at here. But really what we're trying to get at here is the highest value comes from transferring and extrapolating a limited number of observations and information from a small number of fields to all fields in a grower's operation, and then to all fields from different growers in a growing region. And we'll talk about our steps for doing that. So I have an example here. This is actually an example from some work that we're doing. I mentioned that we're doing work with lots of different specialty crops. One of those things is water efficiency in grape growing. So I'm going to use a vineyard here as an example. So when we're talking about scaling, we want to understand what's going on, in this particular case, from a single plant, a single vine, to maybe a row of vines, to the entire vineyard. Same sort of thing. What's going on for a particular head of lettuce, a row, to the entire field, to entire ranch. We also want to understand what's going on, not just in the field, but in the landscape mosaic, what's going on around that field. So other fields that are in production, or other areas of land that may not be in production, but they are part of that broader landscape mosaic. So as a result of doing this road mapping exercise, what we've developed is a pilot effort here to start looking at selected fields and doing some data analytics on those fields, on historical data, and then looking at our decision tools, developing decision tools moving forward. And so we're working with some key growers at YCEDA, and here's the ugly truth, folks. Historical data aggregation and reconstruction is not glamorous. It's kind of painful. Some of us hate to have to go back and find those PDF files or our Excel spreadsheets somewhere and try to make sense of them from 5 years ago. And then, try to make sense of how, what they're saying year to year. But they are essential. They're the most essential foundation to understanding dynamic crop system analysis and to develop these data-driven predictive tools. We have a whole series of different participants from YCEDA, geographically located throughout Yuma, Salinas, also in the Oxnard area, also in the Imperial Valley area. These growers, first of all, thank you all for participating in that. These growers, their total acreage in operation represent 20% of the vegetable acreage in Arizona and California put together. So that's a pretty significant representation to start from. And these are the locations. So we've got the Yuma area, Imperial Valley, Oxnard, Southern Ventura, and Salinas. I'm also showing here 2 areas that we're working on. These are associated with grape growers. But of course, because this database, on the back end, we can utilize data from different geographic areas, and we're learning stuff about these different crops and different soil health in different types of specialty crops. That data is also useful to our study. So the growing regions listed here, obviously, many different types of microclimates here in the Yuma area. We have representation in most of these. Salinas area, 3 different, very different types of microclimates. The Ventura County and Imperial Valley. And I guess I would add that some of the names that were listed there, while they may not be contributing data at this time, they are contributing human resources, expertise. For one example would be TNA. Anthony Duddle, who has, Anthony's back here, got a very strong background in agronomy and statistics and has been working in just about every one of these geographical areas. And so he's also going to be providing insight on some of these preliminary results that we're getting. So here's just an example of the Yuma area, each of the different growing areas or microclimates. So far, when we add up all the different growers involved, the actual fields or ranches that they've contributed, we have a total of 1,500 acres. And what we've done is we've asked them to provide for us fields or ranches where there is low soil-borne disease load and something nearby that has high soil-borne disease load. This data is taken from each of the different growers. It's aggregated and anonymized. So on the back end, we can see all of that data and we can conduct analytics on that data. Each of the different growers, obviously, they can make queries to the system, but they cannot see data that is coming from their colleagues or competitors. And essentially what we end up doing is creating, from this historical data that we're getting from you, we're creating a data stack for each week of the year. So a whole series of different environmental and cultural practice parameters that are coming in from that, and we take that data stack for each week and we generate from that data that you're providing a data stack for every week of the year, because we want to understand what is going on in that field over the course of time spatially. We're obviously, in addition to the private data, we're also collecting public data, weather data, soils data, information like on available water capacity, cation exchange capacity, pH, clay content, these types of things. We are using satellite data. We have some sort of what we're calling the now data and the later data. So higher resolution data will be coming in later on as we start to operationalize this. On the right is a whole list of the different private data that we're working with. And really what we're finding out as we're working with our different growers is not everybody has continuous data for 10 years. That's fine. Some of you have 5 to 6, some of you have 2 to 3. But what we're doing is we're working with you and we're going through understanding how you're collecting your data, how you're storing it, kind of overcoming what we call the data shame, because everybody's collecting data, but a lot of times they don't like to share exactly what that data looks like. And actually that's a big important part of the process that we're going on. The next slide up is where Gerry jumps in and provides some insights on how we're looking at this data and how it relates to productivity and how that's related to soil-borne disease. You want to take it from there, Gerry?
Yeah, just briefly and everything. I know we're pushing your time limit, but if you look at how crops grow and develop throughout the year, we've been working on a concept that we call genetics by environment by management interactions, and it really is environment is the soils and meteorological data, the cultural is the management, and then we've got all sorts of different genetic components that we can put into that. But the ultimate goal is to really look at how those things interplay relative to productivity, and looking at these sequences over time, and where we get these multiple years of data that are out there, we can begin to determine, how stable those yields are in terms of looking at productivity. What are some of the triggers that cause that variation in productivity? Is it primarily environmental, just the weather condition changes? And those can be, for example, and it has nothing to do with lettuce or anything, especially crops, but what we found in corn and soybean production was that the productivity is really governed by July maximum temperatures during the growing season, the August minimum temperatures, and July-August precipitation. Those were the factors that allowed us to determine why we saw the variations among years that we were doing. Now we're back looking very specifically within fields at the combination of what's happening relative to the soil dynamics in all of this. So now when we begin to stack all this data together, as Frank showed you on those different maps, we can begin to drill down through that, look at it from a different perspective. It does take a while to assemble these data so that we were confident in it, but it's really that format that we see on that slide in terms of how's meteorology and soils interact, how's management interact with that, and resultant, what's that variation in productivity over time in all of this. So you can go to the next slide, Frank, in this slide deck. And, basically, we've got all this cultural data we're assembling in all of this. We're trying to understand the data that's been given to us, layer that on the soils data from each field. It really becomes a way of putting together a pretty extensive puzzle in all of this, utilizing the production data that you've given us, but also making sure that anything that we end up with is represented in the aggregate, not on an individual field from that standpoint. So, we're working on this, trying to understand these dynamics, trying to understand just how things interact in terms of within a growing season and among growing seasons, so we can drill down and say, all right, now what's some of the causes that are really driving this overall process. So, we're trying to get close as we can to seeing what the triggers are on soil-borne diseases. And when we start assembling that, we can start then looking at not only the environmental conditions, but sequences of cropping, historical practices on a field as well. So, that kind of gives you an overview of really how we're trying to bring these pieces together to do some pretty novel things with your data set. So with that, Frank, I'll give it back to you.
All right, thanks, Gerry. So quite a bit going on in this effort. Very integrative. A lot of work spent with each and every one of the different production managers and field folks on the various different growers there, trying to understand their data, how they have stored it, what that means, and in some cases trying to understand how we might be able to derive certain parameters from the data that they have collected, but they haven't recorded specific things that we're looking at, but we can derive that from the information that they've provided. And so that's what we're doing right now, assembling this data by field, drilling down and combining the data to start looking at triggers. And we're starting to look at specific groups of growers in each one of these different geographic areas. Ultimately, what we'll be doing is incorporating these things into growing degree day models, agroclimatic models, and then from that being able to understand how to improve sensor detection in fields so that we can have reduce gaps in data, but then also start to take these and try to understand how we can turn those into predictive models or making projections into the future. So we're a little bit over, but thanks. Is there maybe a question? Sure. I love to let Gerry answer all the questions. Yeah. So. So if anything comes up, I'm here for the rest of the time, and we can also provide Gerry's email. Okay, thanks.